And this is from a little book called Prayers in the Celtic Tradition. Lord, from this world's stormy sea, give your hand for lifting me. Lord, lift me from the darkest night. Lord, lift me into the realm of light. Lord, lift me from this body's pain. Lord, lift me up and keep me sane. Lord, lift me from the things I dread. Lord, lift me from the living dead. Lord, lift me from the place I lie. Lord, lift me that I never die. Amen. Amen. We welcome Bruce back. Looking forward to today.
I have been talking in this series about a phase in the development of Reformed political thought. Let me just repeat, I'm going to keep repeating it as long as I have breath in this setting. And that is that one of the characteristics of Reformed Protestants has been their very active interest and involvement in public affairs. That is not uniform in the Christian world. As a matter of fact, there are forms of Christianity, I'm sure you know, that are suspicious of politics and try to avoid it as much as possible. Our tradition is not one of those. Indeed, our tradition comes pretty close to being the opposite. I have to say, however, that there are forms of Reformed Protestantism that deviate from what I've just described. I grew up in a church that a small denomination no longer exists called the United Presbyterians of North America. Very pietistic. Very pietistic, and pietism, in among other things, is one of those strains in Christian thought and practice, which is hesitant about politics. Hesitant. So the idea that you had obligations as a Christian to be involved in public life, much less to wield power and struggle with the moral challenges of that, just wasn't on the horizon. So, but that's a deviant strain. The dominant strain has always been to focus on public power and to seek it, and to when getting a hold of it, to use it. Have no embarrassment about using it for all kinds of purposes, for good and ill. A year ago, I tried to sketch out some foundational ideas that emerged in this tradition at the very beginning, time of the Reformation. That's how a tradition develops. There are certain foundational ideas that get planted, you might say, in people's minds and institutions, and they get passed on. And I'll say one other thing about this. I'm tempted to go down a rabbit trail, which I just will resist fiercely. But one of the most interesting things about traditions is people can be deeply affected by traditions and not be very much aware of it, because it's planted in almost in their makeup. They come from a certain family, and that family has certain traditions, and it's sort of woven into who they are. So part of what goes on when you examine a tradition like this I'm doing, you're sort of doing a kind of genealogy of your own persona, if you're like I am, a cradle Presbyterian. Last year, I talked about foundational ideas developed in the 16th and 17th centuries. And now this year, I'm focusing on the development of this tradition in the next couple of centuries. The 18th and 19th centuries, the 1700s and the 1800s. When people who were in this tradition, aware of this tradition, some of them quite learned about the original ideas, had to apply them in different circumstances. That's the way traditions develop. You take a certain inheritance, and then you have to relate it to new circumstances. I've always been fascinated. In my own professional life, I've just been really fascinated by in many different strands of Catholicism, socialism, all kinds of, you can see the same dynamic. Now, I've talked about this in two different ways, challenges of the 18th and 19th centuries. One was the new challenge of revolution. Revolution was not a new thing. were Reformed Protestants. They were rebellious people. They made some of the most consequential revolutions in that early period. They were not hesitant about that at all. But then they confront a new situation with the emergence of first the American Revolution and then the French Revolution. And I talked about that. And that you see a very interesting dialectic developing there. Rather enthusiastic about the American Revolution, not so much about the French Revolution. And they begin to develop a more complicated idea about the ethics, the morality of political rebellion. I then talked, secondly, last week about democracy, an idea that really did not catch on. Let me say it again, did not catch on in the West until, at least in our sense, until very recently, like a couple of centuries ago. And of course, that presents all kinds of challenges to people when you are used to thinking about politics in a non-democratic way, as they're taking that for granted. Then this thing surges up. What do we? And again, I hope you, if you were here last week, you will remember that I stressed that in the thinking of Reformed Protestants, democracy had promise, but it was morally ambiguous. Had promise, but was more, and I happen to think that's right. I think that's the truth about the subject. I've always had a view that on the one hand, but on the other, there are real possibilities here, opportunities here, but it can easily go off the rails. I think we're being reminded of that in the events of our own time, which is why distinctions are drawn, by the way, by people in legal philosophy and political philosophy between different kinds of democracy. Populism, constitutional democracy, and so forth. Now, today, I want to talk about another big challenge that they face, and that's nationalism. Nationalism. I had a student, amazes me to think it was 20 years ago. It seemed like just yesterday, but 20 years ago, a doctoral student who wrote his dissertation on the theme of, the idea was that we're entering, he was looking at the European Union and phenomena like that. And he said, I think we're involved in moving towards a post-nationalist world. And at the time, that sounded kind of cool. That makes sense. I mean, all this national stuff, we're on our way to putting that behind us. Boy, does it look kind of silly now. Because we've had a surge of what? Nationalism. And by the way, it's one of the more, I think it's one of the more important phenomena in modern politics. It comes and goes, there are waves of it, and then people have different ideas, but we're living right now in one of those waves, one of those nationalist waves, which of course is paired to something that has other labels, but there's I think a historical connection here. There's a kind of globalist surge that goes on when people, and this was what my student was thinking about. Oh, the sort of globalism is just riding roughshod over all these national distinctions. We're on our way to an integrated world where all the barriers are going to come down and so forth. And that's not a new idea. That's something which I'll talk about it today. That's something which has happened before, and it tends to provoke among some people resistance. They see that new world coming and they don't like it. And then they push back, and that's very often the driving animus behind nationalist sentiments. And it appeals, you can just see where I'm going here, it appeals to certain kind of people, that is nationalism, and others not so much. I'm not going to say much by way of definition here, simply because I think it's not easy to define nationalism, but let me offer one thought about it, which I think will do for purposes of this presentation. I think nationalism is best understood as turning the nation into a cause. A cause. Just think about this. All of us, most all of us, have a national identity. Who are you? Well, I'm French, or I'm German, and we should take that for granted. And by the way, just food for thought here, I want to stress to you that if you do not have a national home, that's a big problem, especially if you lack a state that you're connected to. To be stateless is a tragedy. It's a tragedy. And there are people in this world who are stateless. Anyway, the vast majority of people now, particularly in the world of, and this is a very important thing to note, we now live in a world that's mainly nation states. That didn't used to be the case, and I'm going to be telling the story of how that happened. Didn't used to be the case. Now there are over 200 members of the United Nations. So we live in a world of nation states, not empires, not city states. Very important thing to note about the world we inhabit, nation states. Now, if you're in that world and you've got a place, you're French or German or whatever. For many of us, I'm going to speak here just autobiographical, that's kind of a fact. It's nothing more than a fact. I'm not really made conscious of it very much unless I'm abroad. Then I'm aware of it. But I'm not really very, and certainly I'm not the kind of person, I'll just say, who treats the nation as a cause. Indeed, I'm very comfortable even thinking about it. I have to say, when I use the word cause, I'm meaning here something that you would devote yourself to, that you would make sacrifices for, that you maybe even would sacrifice your life for. You see what I'm getting at there. Nationalism turns the fact of national identity into a cause. Something that you will devote yourself to, that you will devote yourself maybe with passion and vigor, and it could even be from your point of view, if you get into this frame of mind, the very thing which defines who you are. Well, I'm a good American, or whatever. So that's the way I'm using nationalism. Nation turned into cause. As I make this presentation this morning, I'm going to focus on two men. I've been trying to link all the way along these ideas, otherwise they just float in the air abstractly. I'm going to focus on two men who are very important in the history of this topic. Two very distinguished figures in the history of Reformed Protestantism. One, a man called Schleiermacher. Boy, that's a mouthful.
Oh my.
Schleiermacher. Friedrich Schleiermacher. Emily will know Friedrich Schleiermacher. Probably one of the 3 or 4 most important theologians in the history of the Reformed tradition. That's a big thing. John Calvin, Jonathan Edwards, Schleiermacher. Could be that. Nothing more than that. So this is a guy who's at the very pinnacle of influence and important ideas theologically, German. And then a different figure, but I think he represents what I'm going to be talking about here today very well also, Lyman Beecher. Father of Harriet Beecher Stowe, known as now to us, it's every bit as much for his children as him, but he was a very important figure in American public life, not just religious circles. He was a Presbyterian / Congregationalist at a time when they were flirting with the Union, which, by the way, if it had happened, I think would have changed some important things, because the Congregationalists were New England, and the Presbyterians were the middle colonies in the South. If they came together, that would have been a big, but they didn't for various reasons. And now they're, I think, well, anyway. But Lyman Beecher was a very successful clergyman in Connecticut, and very influential in Congregational and Presbyterian circles. Very important as a political activist as well as a theologian and pastor. And he was a political activist primarily on the issue of slavery. He devoted a good part of his professional life to very strongly advocating a version of the abolitionist position. I have to say, whenever people say, don't get the clergy involved in politics, my goodness, the whole history of this tradition practically is people like Beecher and Schleiermacher as well being deeply involved in public affairs and having no compunctions about it. Beecher was in New England, he was so much on the anti-slavery side that he offended some people enough getting kicked out of one church in New England. I mean, my goodness, you have to be pretty rabid in New England on that particular issue. But then the remarkable thing about his career, and the thing I'll allude to more later, is that he was induced over his wife's opposition. What she didn't want to do is to go out to godforsaken Cincinnati. I mean, and that's the way she cared. I mean, it was the West. You know, the West was Cincinnati. And the reason for this was that Presbyterians wanted to create a seminary there, Lane Theological Seminary, which would what? Become a kind of sort of preparation, an institution dedicated to preparing clergy to minister in the West, meaning Indiana, or a little farther north, like maybe to go all the way to Illinois, talking about godforsaken. And he did it. He went out there, and it's because of that, in part, that Harriet Beecher Stowe had the experience that she had in Cincinnati of seeing slave trades from right there. And that really triggered her thinking in very interesting ways. He had several children who had notable careers. And just to finish the point about Harriet Beecher Stowe, Lincoln, when he met her, or when he brought her to the White House in the time around the Civil War, introduced her to an audience at the White House, saying, "This is the lady who started the war."
Right.
40. Now, by the way, isn't that interesting? How did she start the war? She wrote a piece of fiction. This is very interesting. Well, I'll get to the real topic. I want to just briefly summarize the situation at the time of the Reformation with regard to our topic. And here it is. The geopolitical situation at the time of the Reformation, the 1500s and the 1600s, was roughly this. You had a very complex mix of different political forms in Europe. Not a simple nation-state system, but a very complex mix. A good part of Europe was ruled by the Holy Roman Empire, and then the Ottoman Empire, big empires. And then you had a few nation-states: England, France, Spain, I'll just leave it there, but basically three. Not Germany, not Italy, no Germany yet, no Italy yet. Low countries are yet to be organized politically, and they get organized in part in that period. The Netherlands is literally a product of that Reformation era, when 7 of the provinces come together to cast off the sort of drive from Spain to impose the Inquisition. And then you have these city-states. Or frankly, I think I've said earlier, that's where Reformed Protestantism emerges, in city-states. And that's a very different political world, the nation states. In Switzerland and the southern part of the German-speaking world, Strasbourg be the best example. So you have this really complex, and many of the areas that we now think of as nations were not yet nations. Italy was not a nation. Germany was not a nation. And so forth. So that's the first thing. You've got a geopolitical world with this kind of smorgasbord of different possibilities. But you have the emergence of a trend which becomes more and more pronounced as this Reformation era goes on, and then goes even stronger towards the consolidation of power in monarchies and the emergence of nation states in that form. And if you really wanted to have a good nation state, what you really wanted to have was a strong central power that could crush the resistance. Think Henry VIII. Swashbuckling, across the stage of history. And by the way, when you didn't have one, like the French didn't have for the longest time because they were divided religiously, that was a problem. And French political thinkers were agitated about it. How can we get this thing that is so desperately needed, which is a strong one? So you have a trend and by the way, you might say the sort of the forward-looking thinking people would say, and I've been reading some of those treatises on the project I'm working on, and they all say some version of what you would hear in a good political science department today. Well, if you really want to be forward-looking, then what you need is a strong monarchy that has all the power concentrated to itself, because that monarchy can then do all the things that are necessary to modernize the country. Can build infrastructure, can crush resistance, can do all those things. So, smorgasbord, pressures moving in the direction of centralization of power in one place after another. I would characterize that as the beginning of nation building. And by the way, what is also evident is that the bigger powers put pressure on the smaller countries, because the smaller countries are feeling that need to get with the program. Swiss, for example, are constantly struggling with that issue. They don't want the city-states, the cantons do not want to become unified. They want their independence, and yet, for economic reasons, they want to be unified. They want to be announced. The third thing you need to know about this period is the following. And this is just not adequately emphasized typically in what I would characterize as church history formulations, and it's this. The Reformed Protestant movement, more, I would say, than any other version of Protestantism, and comparable to Catholicism, it was international and cosmopolitan. Let me stress that again. It was international and cosmopolitan. Its leaders did not speak one language, but a number of languages. Some of them French, some of them German, etc. Think of it. Calvin, French. Knox, Scott, and so forth. Got a whole collection of people. Martin Butzer, German-speaking guy in the Holy Roman Empire, not Swiss, and then on and on. So you've got this kind of collection of people, and the interesting thing about that is they think of themselves as an international movement. They're very clear, and by the way, that's why the Catholics were so apprehensive about it. That's why the Jesuits were created. The Jesuits were the counter-Calvinists. Literally, there's a certain irony, therefore, and I spent my entire career in a Jesuit institution. And by the way, the Jesuits have reminded me of that more than once. Thank you very much. But I hope you see, if you got an international, and this international movement, both international movements, the Jesuits and the Reformed people, what are they dedicated to? Expanding their influence, going into new countries, taking over not just religiously, but politically. And now to complete this little, very quick summary of the situation. Geneva, for example, is sending people into France almost faster than they can produce them. Just boom, boom, and they're sending all these people, pastors for congregations that are emerging. And when the goal is what? To take over. And then there's pushback. So there's conflict. There's a lot of war. The sources of religious wars, in part, is on this. But in a few places, and they are just a few places, in a few places, Reformed Protestants prevail. Scotland is real. The Netherlands is. That's about it. Everywhere else, they're involved in a complicated struggle that they ultimately decide, and what I would characterize as the smart people eventually conclude, we can't win this thing. Which, by the way, is the beginning of such a wonderful thing, the providence of God, a recognition that toleration maybe is better than killing other people. That's the beginning of it, right there. They begin, and typically I have to say also, there are lay people who say that. Lay political leaders for this movement. But anyway, they're sending people out, international movements, sending people, they've got a base of operations in certain cities and so forth. They're sending people out to spread the word and take over. And occasionally they prevail, and when they prevail, you can imagine what that does to their sense of the identity of the nation. The Netherlands is Protestant. Scotland is Protestant, just like Spain is Catholic. By the way, just an aside here, if you travel Europe today, even today, with its enormous secularity, you can still feel the influence. You know, you look at the architecture of those churches, for example, or the internal part of the church. So they go out to try to prevail. This is seeking power and getting power occasionally. And once they get power, if they endure, and they do endure in the few countries I talk, which is why we think of those countries like this as sort of the motherland. You know, the back there. You know, we don't go to Spain to look at the churches, at least not for religious reasons. We may do it for some other reasons. So what begins to happen is the people in those places think of their identity as Protestant. This is a Protestant nation. By the way, England, in a very complicated way, thinks of itself, especially in the reign of Queen Elizabeth, who can't be a Roman Catholic for various reasons. England begins to think of itself, the people begin thinking of themselves as what? That is, the majority of people think of themselves as Protestant. So you have Protestant Europe and Catholic. Now that's the era of the Reformation. Quick version. In a university course, that would be a month. So you get the high points. Now, the next question that I want to jump to is, well, what then, with that inheritance, with that background, what then happens in the era, excuse me, that I want to characterize as nation building? Let me just summarize that era real quickly for you, again, in a kind of overly simple way. The 1800s. Now, by the 1800s, the French Revolution has taken place. The American Revolution has taken place. The Industrial Revolution is unfolding. That's another part of this. One of the most interesting things about that period, in the first part of the 19th century, in the 1800s, in Western Europe, but to some extent Eastern Europe as well, you get surges of nationalism. Surges, and by the way, it's invented in that period, roughly from the time of the French Revolution through the middle of the next century. So roughly the American Civil War. In that period, that's when nationalism emerges, nation as cause. And why does it emerge? Well, that's just an enormous question. But I think people who study this a lot say a couple of things about it. They say one thing, it's in part a byproduct of something I talked about last week, which is the emergence of the popularity of democratic ideas. Now, how are those two things linked? You know, democratic ideas in the simplest and most straightforward form. Political equality, accountability to the elector, just in that simple sense. Why would that be connected to nationalism? Because it is linked to, and I hope you see immediately the connection once I say it, the idea of national self-determination. National self-determination. Because if you got this democratic thing sort of bubbling up, and you look around and say, well, wait a minute, we're ruled by France, or we're ruled by somebody else. One of the kind of instinctive responses on the part of some people, not everybody, is to say, we need national liberation. A phrase that actually begins to emerge in this period. And of course, all of us in this room have lived long enough to know that that is an idea which just keeps rippling and rippling and rippling. I mean, the 20th century is just filled with national liberation kinds of movements. You know, if you start saying the people should be in charge, well, which people? And then if the people, and by the way, if the people think of themselves as different from that ruler, linguistically, religiously, whatever, you can just see very quickly how this would translate into, we need to kick them out. Or to put it positively, we need to have self-government. The other thing which feeds this dramatically is French imperialism coming out of the French Revolution. I'm sure all of you know that once the French Revolution had happened, the people who were involved in that revolution really had an idea. I'm sure Americans can sympathize with this. We've got a terrific thing here. We need to promote it in the wider world. Or maybe even we need to impose it on the wider world. That's why the French Revolution leads to all kinds of wars. All kinds of wars. If they can't persuade people, then they send troops in to do the job. And what does that produce? It produces on the part of the people who are victimized by this a nationalist response. And a good example of that is Friedrich Schleiermacher, whose clear development of a whole theology of nationalism is very closely linked to having to live in a town where there were French troops that occupied the city. Just enraged him and made him into what? A kind of German nationalist. Now, that happened in much of Europe. And you get in this period the emergence of these movements. And by the way, the other dynamic is the other thing that feeds nationalism is a sense that you're weak because you're divided. You're weak because you're divided. That's the Italian case. Italy, for years, some would say centuries, had been divided with these, little city-states that were not able to function together in a way that would enable the country to defend its interests properly. So in this period, you get the Young Italy movement, the Young Turk movement. By the way, that's where that phrase comes from. The Young Turks, the Young Italians, and it's linked to youth, young people standing up and saying. And in the Italian case, what the movement was about, and you know some of the names, Garibaldi and others, they basically their idea was we need to come together, not throw them out, but come together and have a unified nation. And so you get, over the course of the 1800s, literally in one place after another, the emergence of national independence movements that are often successful, producing a unified Italy, a unified Germany. Belgium breaks off from France, and then a whole series of things in Eastern, what we now think of as Eastern Europe and Slavic areas that emerge. What the map begins to look over the course of that century more like what we're used to. Nation here, nation there, nation, self-governing nation. And a very strong sense on the part of lots of people that the nation is a right cause. By the way, it was especially attractive in the first part of the 19th century to young people, young Turks. I know Dad is, willing to swallow this stuff that forces us to be unable to, control our destiny, but by God, we're going to stand up and if necessary, we'll die for it. And let's have a flag which really properly identifies that, etc. So nationalism becomes a cause with more than a little religious overtones, especially if there is a kind of weaving together of religious and political aspirations. And by the way, once that ball gets rolling, it just keeps rolling. And going back to my start and point of departure, I think you have to say now that somebody who says, well, we're leaving it, we're somehow going to put that behind us. I would say that's an idea which now is a little antique-like. By the way, sometimes I think, but when I just read the newspaper, there's nothing new under the sun. There is, but but this stuff is what I'm talking about here is not unrelated to literally what's happening in not just our country, but all in much of the world. All right, Schleiermacher and Beecher, they're representatives of a common reformed response to the thing I'm talking about. Oh, by the way, I have to say one other thing quickly. Many people look upon what happened in the United States of America, the newly formed United States of America in this period, as a kind of complicated version of what I've been talking about, that is the coming together of a nation. Because keep in mind, I think I said this before, keep in mind that the weaving together of those 13 colonies into something that was unified was a very complicated and difficult process. That was now done. But the question was, to what extent were they going to be unified? And then in the middle of that, you get this struggle over slavery, which looks like it's going to break it apart. And when it was over, just again, real quick history, when it was over, in the way that it was over, that is the Civil War, many people said, okay, now we can really get on with the project of making a unified nation. One other thing that's worth noting here is Canada came into being in this period. There was no Canada until the middle decades of the 19th century. Now, with all that, let's talk about our religious ideas for just a brief moment. I want to say, as a broad generalization, that Reformed Protestants in general, for reasons that I hope are now obvious to you, were surprisingly comfortable with the emergence of nationalism. Surprisingly comfortable with it. I think it's related to the fact that they were very comfortable about power, and many of them had power in many of the countries involved. But let's talk about the cases where people had to not just be comfortable, but had to think it through. And my interest is, if somebody sits down in a careful way and tries to think it through, what do they say? Schleiermacher is a very important figure in this regard for the following reason. By the way, the dates, it's so interesting. Schleiermacher was dead by 1832. So he's a kind of first, he's roughly the sort of the generation of the American founding fathers. A little bit different, because he's born when that thing is getting started, but not terribly different. Beecher, on the other hand, lives well into the century. Very interesting. And of course, Beecher's an American, Schleiermacher's a German. I've already said the main thing about Schleiermacher's life experience, but let me just reiterate it. He's a young man living in the western part of Prussia, and these French troops come in, and they're, of course, convinced that they're promoting enlightenment and enabling these poor Germans to get with the program, to do the enlightened thing. And he is offended by their behavior. Not so much their ideas, although it's their behavior. They behave like an occupied force oftentimes does. And of course, we all know about the Germans and the French. It's a little bit like the Scots and the English. Forever. They're kind of irritated with one another. But he draws from that the following conclusion, which then becomes something that over his lifetime, he keeps promoting. That happens in the early 1800s. So he's got some time there to promote the idea. And by the way, he becomes, over the course of his lifetime, a very important public figure. Probably the best known Protestant preacher in the German-speaking world at the time. And of course, a very high level intellectual, big time intellectual. So he's got that. And he's very close to the people in charge, royalty and so forth. So he's an insider. But his view was the following: that indignity that had been visited on German principalities, they're still not yet a nation, that indignity which was imposed by the French, the only thing that's going to prevent that from happening again and again, and for us to be victimized and lose things that are valuable about our culture, that's another thing, our culture, lose things that will be taken away from us if we allow them to sort of promote successfully these very modern ideas that they have. And by the way, Schleiermacher, just so you're clear about this, ain't no conservative. He's a very liberal thinker on many things. Today he would be characterized as a progressive. But he thinks ultimately that there is only one solution to this problem of weakness. And the problem is power, and the solution is power. We need to have a unified nation which will have the military and economic strength and other things to push back and take control of its own destiny. That becomes a big theme. Take control of its own destiny. Okay, that's his political position. And by the way, he didn't live to see that. It happens at the end of the century with Bismarck. But he lays the ground for it. I'm sure he would applaud, basically what Bismarck represented. Finally, he would say. But then he writes he develops what amounts to a kind of theology of nationhood. And that's what makes him so interesting. Because that theology of nationhood in a few sentences is this: And I don't think anybody had ever said this before, quite this way. He said, as I read scripture, and of course he's talking in particular about the Old Testament, not the New Testament. As I read scripture, he says, nations are very much in the plan of God. Nations are very much, God has willed the existence of certain, well, some nations. He's a little vague about all of them, but some nations in particular, God has willed. And God has willed these nations to be, because what? God has a plan for it. Indeed, some nations have a kind of calling. And Germany has a calling. Germany has a calling. Now, he didn't say flatly, nobody else has a calling. But there was a focus on Germany. And by the way, I want to stress here, he was not alone in this time in thinking in these terms. I need not say that to an American audience. You know, in this time, there were a lot of people thinking in these terms, especially people who did this kind of biblical theology thing that he was doing, which is very reformed, very reformed. Go to scripture to find your politics. And then there was another element to the end. But in order for Germany to fulfill its divine calling, its divinely, shall we say, planned calling, it has to be unified. At least it has to be religiously unified. Well, what's the problem with that? Well, you got a lot of Catholics. So what's the solution to that problem? Well, not send them out, but do something pretty close. Marginalize them in public life. I don't know whether you remember Bismarck, but Bismarck very deliberately said, we want that Catholic influence to be marginalized in order for Germany to achieve the things that it needs to achieve in this world. We need to have a unified nation with a common shared Protestant purpose. I have to get the point here where we're going with this. This is a theology which rather specifically leads in the direction of the chosen nation idea for Germany. Now, Lyman Beecher had a similar idea. And I'm not suggesting at all that one influenced the other. I think they were completely independent. And Lyman Beecher was, I would say, a better political thinker than Schleiermacher, but not near the theologian. So it's interesting to compare them. Schleiermacher wrote big books. Beecher gave sermons. And believing me, I'm not speaking pejoratively of sermons, but that's the sort of the genre. I want to call your attention to something that you may even want to read because it's not long and it's available. You can call it up on the web. Plea for the West. It's a kind of a long pamphlet. Very important pamphlet. Plea for the West, meaning the American West, meaning Illinois. But he sketches out there a kind of vision for America. And here's the vision. He sees, and he's kind of proud of this. He said, we are moving westward. Not a hint of any worries about the native population. It's not even in there. We're moving forward across the plains. And that is God's plan. That is God's plan. But there's one problem. As we move across the plains, back there on the East Coast, all these people are streaming into the country who are not Protestants. This is a problem that's got to be dealt with. And of course, one of the things he pleads for is what? Restrictions on immigration that will limit them primarily to Protestants. Because after all, the genius of America, he doesn't use that phrase, but that's clearly the idea. The genius of America is Protestant. The mission of America is Protestant. It's in God's plan. You see literally the same idea. And therefore, he very much appeals for a kind of reaffirmation of what he characterizes as the historic Protestant identity of this nation. And he says, if that happens, then we will be able truly to realize our promise on a much broader scale than we've ever been. We were just on the East Coast. We were just down there on the shores of the Atlantic, but we're moving west. And he has a good idea of where this leads. We're going to populate the West. We're going to populate the West and become this, he doesn't use the word, but I would say behemoth. It's coming. This super nation is coming. But in order for it to fulfill its mission, it's got to retain, I hope you see there, sociologically, it would be cultural unity, but theologically, it would be Protestant identity. I think those are very characteristic reform responses to this very important challenge that nationalism presented. Now, the last thing I want to say about this is just to give you a preview of coming attractions. Because I'm sure by now you're thinking, well, what comes after this? Where are we headed? Other than Christian nationalism. Which, by the way, I hope you see more than a few echoes. In the 20th century, Reformed Protestants tended to have a very, especially after the First World War, that was the moment of truth. Not the Second World War, the First World War, which of course was this terrible bloodletting among these countries, many of which were, it wasn't Protestant Catholic, it was Protestants against Protestants and on, but nation against nation, and nationalism sort of surges dramatically in that war. And in many people's minds was the central cause of that war. And the bloodletting was, shall we say, enhanced by the religious fervor. Young man named Karl Barth, who had studied with people who had the view that I've identified with Schleiermacher and sort of drank it in initially in response to the First World War, said, we've just got to rethink this. We've got to rethink this because where we're headed is to make we're clearly, not only are we on the way to, we are in the process of making the nation an idol. This is idolatry. And of course, he could point very nicely to certain other passages in the Old Testament, especially from the prophetic side, where that was precisely the theme that was raised up against, shall we say, the darker implications of that kind of thinking in Israel's own. And that's one of the reasons, there are about five, but that's one of the reasons why Barth becomes this very important figure, because he's not alone. Reinhold Niebuhr was another one in the United States, raising up the child. As a matter of fact, at one point, both of them said, but I want to focus on Barth said, the problem with the nation is that all too easily becomes an idol in the theologically dangerous sense. It all too easily becomes an idol. And for that reason, this is something that probably we need very much to distance ourselves from. So there's another turn about, that's a preview where eventually I'm going to be talking about these issues again in the 20th century. And by the way, all this stuff, just to add one final note here, all this stuff happens before the rise to power of the United States as a geopolitical force. Keep in mind, all this that I've been talking about today, the United States is not the main player. It's certain Western European countries, largely Protestant countries, that are the big players on the geopolitical stage and building empires. Well, I think I've said enough. Let me stop. Questions, comments, rebuttals.
Just a quick comment. National identity to me is three things: the border, the language, and the currency.
And the currency. You have a restricted view of national identity. But and let me, by the way, I think it's a very good way to think about it. But let me ask you about this. Do you think there's such a thing as the American way of life?
Many people strive for that, whatever it is.
Okay, but is that part of American identity?
The dream would be.
Now, that's a separate thing. But let's add both of them here, American dream and American way of life. Would those, they both
Yeah,
are touching on the thing I'm trying to
Yeah.
get at here.
yes. In a certain way. I mean, if you look at the currency of the world, it's dollars. It's our money. You think of the language, what language dominates the world, the semi-educational world.
Absolutely.
It's-
It's the Latin of our time.
Yes, and of course, the English don't think we speak the right language.
We speak American.
That's right,
Oh,
but
yeah.
I agree, but and people strive, they almost are forced to recognize the dominance of the American.
Okay, let me just, let me just.
I think I'm over
Draw-
my head, actually.
No, no, no. I think you said something very interesting here, but let me just, if you say what you just said, I characterize it as restricted because it doesn't get very directly, maybe immigration does, but I'm not certain. It doesn't get very directly into the points of real conflict about this culture. When you say things like the American dream and the American way of life, a lot of people would say that's part of American identity. You're getting into something which leads to these questions. Is there one American way of life? Even is there one American dream? And then if there is one American dream or one American way of life, let me stick with that. Does that mean that deviant expressions of life in this country are somehow second class or third class? It gets at the question of cultural unity. I said your characterization was restricted because you can say the things I just said and tolerate and even embrace a very wide degree of cultural pluralism.
Sure.
Which is the pull right now, at least from at least part of our novelty. I think one of the most interesting questions about nationalism, building on that, is the following. It historically has been a kind of it has drawn people very strongly in the direction of unity, cultural unity. There's got to be a shared way of life, a shared religion, etc. And one of the big questions of our own time is that there's a resistance to that on grounds that national identity should be plural. And pluralized in the sense that even if there are people who are not of the dominant religion, that should not result in their marginalization or even their reduction to some inferior status. I think part of what's going on right now with respect to, so we say, religiously based nationalism is a rejection of that. Rejection of that is an anti-pluralist myth. Yes.
Bruce, when you said are you gonna continue then this series next year?
If I'm allowed.
Is that your thinking? So we'll be getting into sort of,
See, what
19th and 20th.
I'm basically trying to do here is to see the way in which this tradition has developed in response to a series of problems. And
Yeah.
the problems will be different in the 20th century than they were
Yeah.
in the 19th century. Yeah.
So I was interested in the age breakdown of young Turks and young Italians, and the idea that the young groups were motivating the pro-nationalist
Yeah.
view. And in my lifetime, I've seen the younger Americans actually being counter to that view. So take the Vietnam War, it was kind of, you're making us 18-year-olds go to war,
Yeah.
us with 60-year-olds to have their vision of nationalism. But I'm struck even now, our kids, if you watch the Olympics, American wins the gold medal and they're playing the American, the Star Spangled Banner, they're like, they're not into that.
Well, okay, let me argue with you. Not that I disagree entirely, but which kids are we talking about? Your kids, my kids. That's a little different thing. I think there's a class element to this. I think there are segments of the population who really probably respond very positively to win. We want to win that idea. Now, I'm not being argumentative to be dismissive at all. I think there is something important to what you said, and I think it's related to rising levels of education in the population. That would seem to me would be the place where I would have to have second thoughts about the thing I just said. But if you do look at it, who's attracted to nationalist themes, whether it's Christian nationalism or just make America great again or whatever, that tends to be people who have in one way or another developed the idea that they're marginalized or second class or whatever, whether they be 25 or 65. But understand, I'm sobered by. I'm not going to be flip about saying, well, there's another pocket over here for just the reason I indicated. I think when the level of education rises, it could be subversive of nationalist impulses at a deeper level. That's my thought about this. You in the back.
I just want to make sure I heard you right. You said that religion is leaning away from the it's anti pluralization, right?
No. I said one strain.
Oh,
Reform process.
I was curious if that was going to lead to like a second Reformation.
No. Reform Protestantism, and Reform Protestantism is frankly a very small. It has greater influence because of the, so I would say, the education and social status and power of that group. But no, there are clearly. I mean, I think of much of American Protestantism is exactly the opposite.
Okay.
I think Pentecostals are in a totally different place on this. In Brazil, it was just dramatic how Bolsonaro had a very strong sort of religious nationalist motif in his thought and action, and Pentecostals responded very strongly to it. Like almost like this is what. Well, it's a little bit like what some people are saying about Trump. That this is a figure chosen by God to play such and such role. So I'm not suggesting religion generally. I'm talking about one particular tradition, which is ours.
Jackie had a question.
Yeah.
No, I was just gonna have a response to Rob's, when, maybe you're talking about our country, but, when you look at all these other countries, there's a lot of university students, Tiananmen Square, all the place, the university students are leading, these big demonstrations. And so I feel like that's when you say the Young Turks, you're saying, these units, because that's a group that can get together. Hey, let's go. And then, they go out and protest and they feel like they have a say because they're, they're more educated than maybe some of the other people in their country. But, it's a group that they can identify with and bond.
Well, I was reading just this past week about this party in Germany, Alternative for Deutschland. That is so class specific, and it's not the people you're talking about. And there were a lot of young people there, but they're working class, and many of them feel like they were sold a dream, which turns out to be false. That you were going to have if you got that trade, then that trade was going to translate into a good job and a secure job, and you could do da. And then they say, and obviously that's not the case. And we've been victimized. And then, of course, then the obvious question is, what is the alternative to that? Because it links, as you know well, it links to broader questions about economic policy for the nation and indeed the European Union. Because those people tend to be very critical of the European Union. And I think if they had their way and elected the people they want, they would pull Germany out of the European Union. Yeah.
One quick comment about other nations. Certainly, Vietnam today is about one of the most pro-American countries that there is. not necessarily from religion, but certainly in terms of culture, education, and technology. Having gone there recently and seen the change in that country, Louise and I went into a coffee shop, and we looked around and we said, this could have been Bethesda.
Really?
Had it not been,
Yeah.
seriously,
Oh,
had it
oh.
not been for all these Asian people sitting there with their, their lanyards on and they're chatting sometimes in English,
That's
sometimes in
wonderful.
Vietnamese with their cell phones.
Yeah.
Just like a
But
Starbucks.
a wholesale adoption of that. way of life. But
I've said many times, the frustration of adult education is you just get started.
Yeah.
But I have to tell you a story that's completely off topic.
Yeah, yeah.
I've been sitting in on a class at Georgetown on American Catholicism. And this is related to our church life in a very indirect way. The lecturer was doing just a brilliant job of describing all these trends in Catholicism, American Catholicism. And then he said with a kind of a despairing tone, he said, all of the younger priests are pre-Vatican II. And I said,
Pre-Vatican
he just sort of flipped, and I, being, not the mainly Catholic audience, and I thought I knew what he was getting at, so I raised my hand. What do you mean? And what's the implication? Most all of the younger priests, he said. He said, oh, they are clearly hostile to Vatican II and would like to roll back all of those changes. And he paused, and I said, and therefore, and he said, well, that's our problem in a nutshell. That's our problem. That even, and of course, they were declining this and declining that. But he said, the main problem is when you look at our clergy, he said the clergy are completely conservative in what I characterized as what he said as in the wrong way. Isn't that interesting? And because I have to say, I don't think that's what we would say in our not just in the Presbyterian Church, but others as well. Anyway, just a little nugget of information.
Thank you, Bruce, very, very much for